Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Newport Nuptials by Cindy Nichols. Narrated by Nan Mcnamara. Chapter 1. Sawdust swirled in the air, just like it had been for over a month at Jen Watson's house. She held her hand over her mouth as she swiped a wet rag over the chairs on the deck. It wasn't the first time she'd done it, and it wouldn't be the last, but she was certain she'd done it more often in the last month than ever in her life at her grandmother's Newport Beach house that was now hers. Well, not exactly hers, but close enough for now. She hadn't expected that when she'd come to the house in June to stay for the summer, that she'd never leave, and that her longtime friend Faith would start a pillow business and be staying at the house with her. She shook her head, marveling at how things had all turned out. Just as she finished wiping off the chairs and trying to fluff the dust out of her hair, she thought she heard a voice over the balcony. "Hi, Mrs. Grover," she said, waving at her elderly neighbor. She raised her eyebrows at Mrs. Grover's newly coiffed hair, white clam diggers, and cute powder blue sweater. And was that lipstick she had on? That had to be a first. "Hello, Jen," Mrs. Grover said, smiling up at Jen and glancing over at the downstairs window into the kitchen. She rose onto her tiptoes, glancing in the other window. It took a minute, but Jen finally understood why Mrs. Grover was all dressed up and why she was on Jen's sidewalk at all. "Oh, Earl and Keith knocked off a little early today. They had to go get more supplies. But they sure made a mess while they were here." Jen swung the dust cloth against the railing of the balcony, sending a plume of dust in Mrs. Grover's direction, and Mrs. Grover took a quick sidestep to avoid it. "Oh, sorry about that." Jen set the rag in the corner and turned back toward Mrs. Grover. "Meet me in what's left of the kitchen. I'll head down." A minute later, Jen and Mrs. Grover were in the kitchen, and Mrs. Grover said right away, "Whatever makes you think I was looking for Earl? Earl and Keith. I just wanted to say hello." Jen bit her tongue before she could say what she was thinking. That maybe it was the lipstick, or the fact that Mrs. Grover brought Earl and his son Keith cookies regularly and cooked for them most evenings. But she didn't want to embarrass Mrs. Grover, who so far had vociferously denied that they were anything more than friends. "It looked like you wanted to say something. What was it?" "Oh, well, nothing, I guess." Mrs. Grover smiled, opting not to divulge anything, if there was anything to divulge. Mrs. Grover looked around and made a tisking sound. Jen looked up at her neighbor, not sure what she was tisking about. Mrs. Grover surveyed the kitchen, the empty spaces where cabinets should be, the floor in the living room that was half tile, half scraped concrete. Jen handed Mrs. Grover a platter of appetizers that she'd made, since it was Friday and her best friends Carrie and Faith would be over for happy hour any minute, as they'd agreed that this evening would be when they'd plan the baby shower that her son Michael had asked Jen to plan for his wife. Well, Faith did live there, but she'd spent the day with Gary. Or was it Jean? She'd been dating Gary and friends with Jean. At least that's what Jen surmised. She wasn't sure, but knew Faith would fill her in later, and she should be home any minute. Carrie breezed in, wine in hand. She looked around quickly, and then over to Jen. "Wow, since they got that tile saw, they've really been at it, haven't they?" Jen had had to wait for ages to get the flood damage repaired, and had been without a kitchen for over a month now, and her good humor about it had just about run out, if it hadn't already. "Yes, they have. They've been working really hard, and they promised that they'll be done in time for the shower." She turned to Mrs. Grover and said, "You were going to say something, Mrs. Grover?" Mrs. Grover tugged at her earring. "Who, me? No, I wasn't. Yes, it looks like they've been working hard." "Oh, I thought you were tisking, which is usually followed by some sort of statement." Jen glanced at Carrie and held in her laugh, but Carrie didn't. "Mrs. Grover, you really should never, ever play poker. Really." Mrs. Grover looked surprised and objected. I'm a master bridge player. That takes some facial mastery. Facial mastery. That's an interesting way to put it, Carrie said, taking the chilled wine bottle and glasses from Jen and turning to follow her upstairs. Come on, Mrs. Grover, join us for happy hour. We have to talk about the baby shower we're supposed to plan for Michael. His mother-in-law was supposed to do it, but she's apparently abandoned ship. Mrs. Grover carried the platter up the stairs behind Jen. So, you're the cavalry? She asked. Apparently, Jen replied, but we've done it before. Carrie laughed and rolled her eyes. That's an understatement. We had to pull off an entire wedding at the very last minute. They were lucky they had food for the guests, and I ended up acting as the bartender, if you can believe that. Mrs. Grover's eyes widened as Jen and Carrie explained all the other things that had gone wrong with Michael and Amber's wedding that they'd had to cover for. The weird thing is that all along, Amber's mom said it was handled. Flowers, photographer, all of it. And it wasn't. Oh my, Mrs. Grover said. And how did she respond when no flowers arrived and you had to do it? Boy, did we have to scramble, Carrie said, shaking her head slowly. And as I recall, all she did was shrug her shoulders, like, oops, with a big smile on her face. I can't even imagine, Mrs. Grover said, taking the glass of wine that Carrie offered her. I'd have blown my top. Jen laughed. We didn't have time for that. But I will say that there were a few choice words about Greta Blake afterward. Lucky she wasn't anywhere nearby. How'd she get put in charge of something like this again? Mrs. Grover asked. I think Amber asked her. It's pretty common for the mom to do the shower, isn't it? Carrie shrugged. Maybe in a normal world, but this is not a normal world with her involved. This is going to be much easier, and will save us from having to scramble at the end again. It's just better if we have it here. Have what here? Faith asked as she came out on the deck and held her empty wine glass in Carrie's direction. The baby shower, Carrie said as she filled Faith's glass. Jen sighed when Faith's eyebrows rose and she laughed. Here? Here? Where there are no floors, no cabinets, no appliances? She patted her chair cushion a few times before she sat down on it, plumes of dust billowing out. And sawdust in every nook and cranny? Jen squared her shoulders and knocked a bit more dust out of her hair. I asked Earl and Keith if they thought they could get it done, and they said yes. So I'm going with that. Mrs. Grover looked over the balcony where stacks of lumber sat next to the rose garden and Jen's new stove that was still in the box, next to the new refrigerator that was also in a box. Well, hope springs eternal, she said, lifting her wine glass along with her eyebrows. Chapter 2. An hour later, they had a list of things that needed to be done, from invitations and favors to games and food. They also had a list of things they needed to talk to Amber and Michael about, like the gift registry. The only thing they had left to do was to divvy it up. Jen was feeling a bit better about the whole thing when her phone rang. Oh, it's Michael. Hang on, I'd better get it and let him know we're making progress. Jen quickly filled him in on the conversations they'd had so far and mentioned that even Mrs. Grover had some great ideas which she was sure would make the event a success. Thanks, Mom, Michael said slowly, and Jen noticed a familiar hesitation in her son's voice, the one that was always there when there was something he had to tell her but didn't want to. She couldn't imagine what it could be. Mom? Yes, Michael? Jen waited, not knowing how to get him over the hump of saying what he needed to say. I know that I asked you to help with the shower. Amber was so excited, then crushed at every turn. I didn't want to have the shower like the wedding. Well, actually, she didn't know what happened at the wedding. We managed to keep that from her, remember? In fact, at the reception, she went on and on about what a wonderful job Greta had done. I know, Mom, I remember, Michael said with a groan. And Greta didn't correct her either. Just sat there with everybody gushing about the whole thing. I know, Mom, Michael repeated. Not that I'm a bit resentful, Jen said, wishing she could have put all that back in her mouth. But it was true, after all, and this shower would be so much better since they could start from the beginning, not after the fact. And she told Michael so. About that, Michael said, and hesitated yet again. What is it? We had dinner with Greta over the weekend and, well, she's really excited about the shower too. And Amber's excited to have it there. Jen was silent for a moment. This certainly threw a monkey wrench into her plans, but she didn't want to say that. Yet. So, okay, if Greta wants to have it at her house, how am I supposed to be helpful if she says again she's got everything covered and doesn't? Michael sighed and moved on to his fallback position. Mom, it's girl stuff. How am I supposed to know? Jen was stunned. She hadn't imagined that Greta would have any interest in helping after she'd already dropped the ball, and certainly not that she'd want to still have the party at her own home. She wasn't even sure what to say to her son, but apparently she'd repeated enough of the conversation that by the time she hung up, Carrie and Mrs. Grover stared at her in silence, their faces sympathetic. I'm sure that won't be easy, Mrs. Grover said. Jen sighed and looked down at her hands, her mind whirling with thoughts of how best to approach Greta to coordinate yet maintain complete control, almost without her knowing. I don't see how I can, she said finally. Carrie looked equally shocked. I don't know if we can pull off a repeat of the wedding. How does it even work, with it at her house? Jen shook her head slowly. I have no idea. I mean, I thought we had great ideas, and I was finally feeling like we could pull this whole thing off. It's only in a few weeks. I heard you say you were going to meet them tomorrow for lunch. Maybe you can just convince them that this is a better place to have it. Okay, you're right. I just want to have it here. And I guess I sort of assumed that since she wasn't stepping up, we'd have full control and not have to scramble like we did last time. Carrie laughed and lifted her glass. Well, at least we're lucky it's early in the day and she won't be needing a bartender. Not sure I want to try that again. Faith nodded. You were horrible at it. You're a much better dentist. Stick with that. Jen was disappointed, but she spent the rest of the evening with her friends, trying to figure out how they could help Michael and Amber and still let Greta believe she was in charge. And she wasn't at all sure how to do it. You're meeting tomorrow? Faith asked. Jen leaned back in her deck chair and folded her arms across her chest. Yes. I don't really want to, but he sounded so, I don't know, desperate. Faith glanced over at the annex, where her workers would be returning in a couple of weeks. I need to head inland anyway and pick up some fabric at my house for the new spring designs. The girls will be back and ready to start sewing again in a couple of weeks. Jean and I laid out a business plan, but it'll require more inventory. Carrie, Faith, even Mrs. Grover stopped with what they were doing and stared at Faith. Jean? Business plan? Carrie asked. I thought you were dating Gary. Who said anything about dating? Faith asked, clearly annoyed. I don't know what I'm doing. Gary and he's fun to go out with. He likes to go to cool places. Jean is a very successful businessman and has offered to help me with my business. You know, like a mentor. A mentor, Jen repeated. She'd seen how Jean looked at Faith when they were together, and she thought he was likely more interested in Faith than as a mentor. But he was very nice, and she was grateful that he was helping her friend get her business to even higher heights. Okay, you want to join us for lunch then? We can ride together. Faith flashed both palms at Jen. No, not a chance. I can drop you off and head to my house, get what I need. You're going to try to change her mind, aren't you? I don't want to be anywhere near that. Jen stuck her chin in the air in indignation. What? So maybe it crossed my mind. Carrie, Faith, and Mrs. Grover all laughed at the same time. "I imagine you can be quite formidable, Jen. I don't blame Faith for wanting to just slow down the car and let you jump." Jen couldn't help but laugh, too. Her friends, both new and old, sure did know her pretty well. And changing Greta's mind was exactly what she had planned. She just hoped it worked. Chapter 3. Jen hadn't seen Joe for a few days, and she'd missed their quiet evenings alone when they'd cooked together, before the flood. She hadn't had a kitchen since, so when Joe mentioned that his mother would be away for a few days, she jumped at the chance to make dinner for him at his house. They'd planned the menu together, and Jen laughed when he pulled his own apron out of the pantry and swung it over his head. It was one of the things that she'd fallen for first about him, and she loved when they cooked together. Tonight had been good therapy. Jen and Joe finished up with the dishes, and she smiled as she took in the sight of the sparkling clean kitchen. She dried her hands on a dish towel and led Joe out to the porch. The night was chilly, but the porch was cozy as it was heated. The bright stars shone in the night sky, and the peaceful sound of the waves crashing against the shore surrounded them. "It was a fantastic dinner," Joe said as he sat down in one of the deck chairs. Jen smiled. "Thanks," she said. "I'm glad you liked it. Couldn't have done it without you." Over dinner, Jen had explained her plan to Joe. How she intended to convince Greta to let her host the shower at the beach house. That Greta had almost ruined the wedding. All of it. He'd been uncharacteristically quiet as she explained, and she took a quick glance at him to see if he'd been paying attention. Joe looked out at the night sky for a moment, and then turned to her. "Why do you feel like you need to do everything yourself?" he asked. Jen sighed. She knew he was referring to the baby shower she was planning for Amber. She was determined to do it at her house so she could make sure everything went well. But she'd really had no intention of doing it all alone. "Oh, I'm not doing it alone. Faith and Carrie are helping. Mrs. Grover even wants to help, and I'm sure your mother would—" "That's not what I meant," he said, looking up at the stars. The wind picked up, and he reached for her hand and held it between his against the chill. Jen looked up at Joe, puzzled. She wasn't sure what he was getting at. He had been so quiet during her explanation of her plan to host the baby shower, and she wanted to know what he was thinking. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly, as the wind blew strands of hair across her face. He turned his gaze back on her and gave her a warm smile. "You want to be able to control everything," he said gently. "That's why you feel the need to do it all yourself." She paused for a moment, surprised by his insight. She hadn't expected him to understand how she felt all her life since Alan died. But he did, and it gave her a sense of comfort and security that she hadn't known before. I guess I just don't want anything to go wrong," she admitted finally. "I mean, this baby shower is important to Amber and everyone else who loves her." Joe nodded in understanding, still holding her hand firmly in his own. He didn't say anything else, but the look on his face spoke volumes. It was more than that, though. She knew it, and she guessed Joe did, too. "I don't know," she said. "I guess I'm just used to doing it all myself. Ever since Alan died, I've had to take care of everything. I raised 2 boys on my own, and I guess I don't trust anyone else to do a good job of anything." Joe reached out and took her hand. "I wish I'd been there for you then," he said, and Jen's heart tugged at the sadness in his voice. "But I'm here for you now. You don't have to do it all." Jen sighed and looked away as tears filled her eyes. She had been so strong for so long that it felt like a dam breaking now that she let herself admit what her life had been like. It was a relief. Joe pulled her close and held her tightly, rubbing her back with one hand and stroking her hair with the other. It was almost as if he could feel the emotion she was feeling, and he wanted to make sure she knew that he was there for her, no matter what. After a few minutes, Jen stepped back and wiped away the tears from her cheeks. She smiled up at Joe, feeling grateful for his understanding and acceptance. "Thank you," she said softly, taking his hand in hers once more. "I know I'm not always easy to be around." "No, you're not," Joe agreed, though his voice retained its gentle tone. "But I love you anyway, and I'm here for you every step of the way." Jen smiled wider at this realization. She loved Joe. There were no two ways about it. And she wanted to believe that he was there to stay. She really did. But sometimes those old demons got the better of her. Better to just keep going. Hope for the best. Prepare for the worst. Jen seemed to sense what he was thinking and shook her head slightly before speaking again. "It wasn't your fault," she said firmly. "You were dealing with enough of your own grief without shouldering any extra burden, and you were married and had responsibilities of your own." Joe nodded slowly in agreement before pulling her closer again. She closed her eyes briefly against the night sky above them. It felt good to have someone understand her like this. Joe had been here when Alan passed away. Joe helped her on with her coat as she got ready to leave. "You know, you could leave the shower at her place and you guys just do the rest, you know. You've got a lot of help for that with Faith and Carrie." She sighed, not sure she could let go of the reins. It had been too long, decades, and she knew she had a lot of help whenever she needed it, but it wasn't the same as being in control. Joe walked her home, neither of them speaking, but hand in hand. He walked her up to the door and left after a gentle kiss. "Call me tomorrow, and let me know how it goes with Greta." "I hope you get what you want," he said, as he headed back down the boardwalk toward his house. For a moment, she considered that maybe he was right. She didn't have to be in charge. She could let her friends help, and she would be able to relax and enjoy the event. She took a deep breath and smiled, feeling a little more hopeful. Chapter 4. Jen didn't say much on the drive to Michael and Amber's, playing over her conversation with Joe the night before. Maybe she should be able to just give this up, but it didn't take long for her to admit to herself that she didn't want to. She arrived at Michael and Amber's apartment, feeling nervous but also excited. She had a mission to convince Greta to let her host the baby shower at the beach house. Faith dropped her off at the curb, declining to even come in and say hello. "Not a chance. If I get too close, you'll talk me into staying. I'll come in and say hello after it's all over." "Oh, come on. You could help." Faith shook her head as Jen got out of the car. "You don't need my help. If I thought you did, I'd stay. Good luck. May the best woman win." Faith drove away with a wave, and Jen stood on the grass outside Michael and Amber's apartment building, looking up at their second-story windows. She took a deep breath and started up the steep, narrow stairs to Michael and Amber's apartment. Jen's heart raced as she stepped up, the old wood creaking beneath her feet. It seemed too dangerous for a new baby. At the top of the stairs, Amber opened the door and welcomed them in with a smile. The apartment was tiny and cramped, barely fitting the four of them. Amber was glowing with happiness, her pregnancy obvious. She couldn't wait to have the baby shower, and Jen could see the hope in her eyes as she asked Greta and Jen to plan it. "Jen, you made it!" Amber exclaimed, giving her a hug. "Of course, I wouldn't miss this for the world," Jen replied with a smile. Greta approached her, looking uncertain. "Jen, it's so good to see you. How are you?" "I'm doing well, thank you. How about you? How's the planning going for the baby shower?" Jen asked, trying to steer the conversation towards her goal. Greta's face fell. "It's not going as well as I had hoped. I just can't seem to find the right venue. Everything is either too expensive or too far away, and I'm not positive that my house would be big enough, honestly." This was the first that Jen had heard that Greta was considering renting a venue. All the more reason for them to have it at the beach house, for free. Jen took a deep breath and jumped in. "Well, I have a solution for that. I was thinking, why don't we have the baby shower at my house by the beach? It would be the perfect setting for a baby shower," she said, with a warm and encouraging smile. "And it wouldn't cost a thing." Greta looked hesitant. "But What about the kitchen remodel? Won't it be a mess? The contractors promised me that they could be finished in time. Plus, I have plenty of room for all the baby supplies, Jen added, trying to sound as convincing as possible while she looked around the tiny, cramped apartment. Michael stepped in. Mom, I think it's a great idea. Your house would be perfect for the baby shower, and I'm sure everyone would love it. Amber nodded in agreement. Yes, it would be so much more relaxed at Jen's house. Plus, the views are amazing. Greta looked back and forth between her daughter, her son-in-law, and Jen. She let out a sigh. Okay, let's do it. We'll have the baby shower at Jen's house. Jen felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had been worried about hurting Greta's feelings, but it seemed like everything might work out in the end. Amber suggested they eat lunch, and Jen followed her to the kitchen, which was really just a corner of the living room. Greta sat and chatted with Michael as Jen helped Amber set the table and dress the beautiful salad she had made for them all. As she set the last fork on the table, Amber surprised Jen with a hug. Amber whispered, "Thank you, Jen. I really want the shower to be awesome, and I know it will if you're in charge." Jen was so surprised that she took a step back, wondering how much Amber actually did know about the wedding. They'd never discussed it, and Jen had no intention of doing so now. She really was a sweet girl, and Jen was happy that she could help. That's all that mattered. As they all sat down to enjoy their lunch, the conversation turned to the excitement of the new baby. Jen couldn't help but feel grateful for the new life that was about to enter the world, and for the opportunity to host the baby shower at her house, continuing on with a new generation, just as she had planned. As they ate, Amber started gushing about the baby shower. She talked about decorations and food and games, her enthusiasm contagious. Jen couldn't help but smile as she listened. After lunch, Faith knocked on the door to take Jen back to the beach. Jen smiled as Faith hugged Amber and Michael and nodded to Greta. "Oh, little darling, you look like you're going to pop. We'd better get this shower together fast," Faith said as she smiled at Amber. "That's the plan," Jen said as she gathered her purse and sweater. "Oh?" Faith asked, her eyebrows raised as she looked at Jen. Michael hugged Faith and headed toward the door. "Yes, Greta and Mom decided to have the shower at the beach house. It's all set," he said with a big smile and nod toward Jen. When Michael closed the door behind them, Jen hurried down the stairs and hopped in Faith's car. As soon as Faith got in, she put her hand up for a high five. Faith laughed and smacked Jen's hand. "Mission accomplished," Jen said, as Faith pulled away from the curb. Chapter 5. Jen sat on the deck, her feet on the coffee table, as she chewed on the eraser of her pencil and stared at the legal pad that hadn't left her hand in days. Ever since they'd agreed to have the shower at her house, she'd gone into overdrive trying to make sure they had everything in order. Keith and Earl had stared at her, wide-eyed, when she'd told them they had a new deadline. She thought Keith had maybe even gulped, but they said they'd do their best. And the result of the full-court press was more. More sawdust, more noise, more commotion. So she'd taken to spending most of her time up on the deck to stay out of the way. She caught some movement from the corner of her eye and peered over the balcony of the deck. "I can't hear you," Jen said as she leaned over the railing. Mrs. Grover stood on the sidewalk, and Jen could tell that she was talking, but she couldn't hear a thing over the noise of the tile saw downstairs in her kitchen. Mrs. Grover had her fingers in her ears as well, but her lips continued to move. Jen gave up trying to figure out what she was saying and motioned for her to come upstairs. She pointed towards the outside staircase, as there was no way Mrs. Grover was going to be able to get through the big mess that was Jen's living room and kitchen. But at least Keith and Earl had gotten the tile saw they needed from their new friend Jean, and so progress was being made. Nothing could really make Jen happier at the moment. "When I left this morning, I said I would be by this afternoon," Mrs. Grover reminded Jen when she finally made it up the stairs. Jen nodded and pulled out a chair for Mrs. Grover to sit in. She'd been waiting for her to come and hadn't known what time, but now that Mrs. Grover was here, Jen was happy to share her list of things that she was making notes about for the baby shower.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?